Rain whispered against the armor glass windows of listening post Theta Epsilon 9. Each droplet a quicksilver tear, catching the nascent light of Tarsus Secundus dawn before sliding downward in broken paths, distorting the view of mountains whose peaks vanished into low-hanging clouds, stained violet by the planet's pallid sun. Within those mountains' embrace, the outpost clung like a scarab to stone, its reinforced walls cradling 4 souls who bent over their work with the devotion of acolytes tending sacred flames. Warm yellow light from lumen globes pooled on Margot Herodian's desk as his quill scratched across parchment older than some imperial warships, the ink glistening like fresh blood against vellum that smelled of dust and forgotten libraries. Rain and respiration conspired to fog the air, mingling with the perpetual haze of incense snaking from censers bolted to the Flormir and sacred unguents, fighting a losing battle against the sterile tang of recycled atmosphere that hissed through ancient vents. Beyond the eastern window, peaks nod at cloudbanks pregnant with tomorrow's storm, but Herodian's mismatched Isone still soft with mortal weariness, the other a cold augmetic lens whirring softly as it adjusted focus saw only the words taking shape beneath his hand. The words that might yet salvage a shred of hope from the Devourer's endless hunger. He paused, the nib hovering above the phrase, unlike any other predator in mankind's long and blood-soaked history, as recycled air shifted around him. No need to glance sideways to confirm his companion's presence. Decades had rendered their rhythms as familiar as his own ragged breath. To his left came the arrhythmic clicks of lexicographer Missé's data slates, her fingers a pale blur as she cross-referenced astropathic shrieks from the Dianthus morning's harvest, included a garbled account of skybeasts darkening the moons of Pelagia Station, marked urgent by the machine spirit for Octavius' attention. The xenobiologist's station exhaled chemical vapors and the wet sound of scalpel on chitin, his servworms clicking like impatient insects as they dissected a biosample couriered through 7 light-years of contested void. Only archivist Calera maintained perfect stillness before her humming array of voxcasters, spine straight as a lasgun barrel, face serene beneath the weight of horrors streaming through her neural implants. 4 decades since Inquisitor kin gathered them here on this dagger's edge of the Nephilim sector. 4 decades watching the shadowplay of splinter fleets converge leviathans, children swallowing systems whole as they followed the siren song of the astronomicon burning at Terra's heart. Herodian flexed his ink-stained fingers, the ache in his knuckles an old companion, and found the cold comfort of the purity seal hanging at his throat. 53 years since the ecclesiarchy's oils had sanctified his oath to record truth without embellishment or fear. 53 years since scented smoke coiled around his head as the brand seared into parchment. Let no falsehood tarnish the Emperor's light. How naive he'd been in the librarium cathedrals of Terra Salis, envisioning a life debating historiography over dusty tomes. Not crouching at the galaxy's fraying hem, documenting atrocities with shaking handset here his trembling quill preserved the screams of Helios Primos the way amber traps ancient flies. Second day of Quintus, he could still recite the final Vox log, stratospheric pressure, dropping 80 kilopascals in 3 hours. Spore-choked refugees choking in the streets as capillary towers burst through planetary crust. 17 days from outbreak to silence. 17 days of voices fraying from clipped military reports to animal howls before the void swallowed them whole. It never leaves you, does it? Calera's murmur startled him, so rarely spoke unprompted. Her augmetic eyes remained fixed on flickering runes, but her lips shaped the words again. The first system you hear devoured. Rain intensified, drumming a dirge on the armor glass. Herodian watched a droplet wend its way through rivulets already etched by 10,000 previous rains. I dream of Vanek sometimes, tech priest of Tyron Primus. The trembling in his binaric cant, Calera said, a statement, not a question. Her fingers danced across the Vox panel, spinning stellar reports into coherent streams. The silence stretched, filled with the ghosts of dead airwaves. A shudder passed through the stationot, the familiar groan of mountain winds straining at plasteel, but the deeper vibration of macrocannons miles below, buried in Tarsus Secundus granite flesh. Herodian marked how Missé's fingers didn't falter at their task, how Octavius' scalpel continued its methodical work. They'd grown numb to the percussion of distant artillery. Routine. Routine is the mortar binding our sanity, Herodian thought, watching Misay's databanks auto-catalog the Pelagia transmission. Perhaps the soul's truest armor is repetition. He released the purity seal, fingertips brushing the manuscript before him the nature and movements of the Great Devourer, Vol. XVI its pages heavy with annotations on adaptation rates in xeric biospheres. 80 million souls evacuated from Karl's sun-scorched plains 3 cycles past because he'd connected the migration patterns to Darren's fall. 80 million lives bought with ink and insomnia. Rising stiffly, Herodian approached the eastern window, boots scuffing worn floor plates grooved by generations of pacing scholars. His reflection ghosted across the Armor-Glass's stooped silhouette haloed by candlelight. Face carved with crevices deeper than Tarsus Canionce's, the view beyond sharpened through his augmetics magnification subroutines. Night clung stubbornly to the mountain's western faces, but above, patches of star-strewn void shone through the storm's hem. There, where the constellation locals called the Blind Harvester glimmered. No unaided eye could see the battle unfolding 7 light-years coreward, but Herodian's lens parsed the faint staccato flickers between Pelagia's 2nd and 3rd planets. Dying drives, plasma bursts, the last breaths of frigates whose names would soon join the mountain of data choking Misay's servers. He thought of the Raven Guard speeding samples through the warzone. If their Thunderhawk survived, Octavius would have fresh nightmares for his microscopes by week's end. His breath fogged the cold glass. This outpost's greatest weapon wasn't its hidden guns or fleet Orpheus patrols, but perspective. The Devourer moved on scales that baked mortal haste into irrelevanza fleets like termites gnawing at a cathedral's foundations. From here, patterns emerged across decades. The way splinter fleets shifted vectors after consuming forge worlds rich in rare metals, how void encounters seeded subsequent bioforms with improved armor against macrocannon fire. Even voidsmen's tales became data points. Like distant heartbeats in the Vox static, that Fornax frontline captain had described the Shadowham preceding the Jopra atrocity. 6 months later, a Navy kill team recovered a Tyranid bioship's sensory organ throbbing to that same rhythm. The quill awaited him when he returned faithful as any service call. Dipping it into ink the color of clotted stars, he resumed writing. The Biotitan designated Hierophant by Imperial forces reveals unprecedented structural adaptations when compared to Kara's sector specimens, suggesting Octavius' low hum interrupted his flow, the xenobiologist's standard reaction to troubling discoveries. Herodian didn't look up. Knowledge would circulate among them soon enough. Time here flowed like glacier melt swift in moments, yet carving deeper channels with each passing year. He wondered, not for the first time, if the Hive Mind measured their lonely vigil. Did synapses crackle with awareness of this stone burrowed into its flank, this persistent irritant dissecting its children? The question chilled him more than mountain drafts. Against foes driven by wrath or ambition chaos filth scrabbling for demonhood, orcs bellowing for battle one might find purchase for defiance. But how did one hate a hurricane? Fear of void-cold intellect older than the Imperium itself, an entity to whom their struggles were less than ants warring beneath a titan's tread. His quill moved faster, ink spattering like miniature void fields. Specimen displays chitinous reinforcement patterns consistent with orbital bombardment resistance first documented during the siege of Hive Tempestus, but modified with every syllable an act of rebellion. Every sentence, however fragile, a barricade against oblivion. Somewhere above, a starship died silently, its death throes glittering down through Tarsus atmosphere as faint as lost origami wishes. Herodian's augmented eye caught the flicker. His ink pooled dark and patient as a shadow on the page below. The stars over Tyran Primus had gone cold long before the Adeptus Mechanicus vessel broke through the warp, its engines sputtering with the exertion of a journey made too late. What awaited them was not a world, but a carcassa hollow-ed-out mockery of life itself. The oceans, once vast and teeming with currents that nourished 1,000 species, had shriveled into brackish puddles under skies turned the color of dried blood. Where forests had carpeted continents, their roots delving deep into fossil layers older than Terra's first empires, there remained only cracked earth, smooth and featureless as bones stripped by scavengers. No ash, no wreckage, no lingering radiation, just absence. The research station lay in ruined ribbons, its metal warped as if chewed by jaws larger than planets, and of Margos Vanek, the brilliant xenobiologist whose final transmission had clawed its way through the void, there was no trace, not a fingernail. not a hair. Only his hidden data crypt endured, buried 3 kilometers beneath the dead crust like a seed planted in barren soil, last gasp of defiance against the hunger that had taken his world. When Inquisitor Fides Cryptman, his face a roadmap of scars and sleepless nights, first decrypted the codex, those who served him witnessed a transformation. The weight of centuries spent hunting heretics and horrors seemed to lift from his shoulders. His bloodshot eyes, usually heavy with the toll of secrets no mortal should bear, ignited with a terrible clarity. For days that bled into nights, he sequestered himself within chambers choked with flickering hololiths and crackling data feeds, piecing together Vanak's fragmented observations like a prophet assembling blasphemies. The patterns were there, etched in the silence of dead star systems, 37 worlds along the eastern fringe, erased in perfect sequence. Not conquered, not bombarded, consumed. Each disappearance followed by the same chilling phenomenastrae biosignatures, caught drifting in the vacuum like shed skin, gravitational distortions that bent starlight into sigils of dread, astropathic screams, fading into the howl of something vast enough to swallow thoughts whole. He did not send reports. He sent a dirge, encoded in Machinkant and blasted toward distant Terra on frequencies reserved for extinction-level threats, a single phrase repeated until the relays screamed. Hive Fleet Behemoth comes. Terra did not answer. Not then, not when Cryptman dispatched envoys to sector capitals, his warnings sharpened by urgency, nor when his own ship, the Emperor's Light, began to falter in the deepening warp shadow. Something monstrous was moving, its psychic presence so colossal it smothered the immaterium like a pall. By the time they reached Tandros, where the Telepathica station had broadcast one final, garbled transmission that ground its breathing there, was nothing left but silence and scorched rock. Horror hardened into certainty. The tendrils of the threat were curling toward Ultramar, drawn like flies to the bright, beating heart of Robout Gilliman's legacy. Cryptman dragged himself from the wreckage, his robes dusted with the chalk of dead worlds, and prepared to make his plea not to blind bureaucrats, but to a warrior forged in fires older than the Imperium itself. Manus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, was sculpted from the same granite as the mountain beneath his fortress monastery. 10,000 years of war had not bowed his spine, but when Cryptman stood before him, spattered with grime from a dozen graveyards of worlds, even the legendary Lord of Macragge felt the air grow thin. The Inquisitor spoke not of battles, but of Indingsoft ecosystems unraveled in hours, of oceans drunk to mud by mountain-sized maws, of entire populations rendered down to biomass before they could scream. Calgar listened, fingers curling into fists as tales of planets like Prandium the Gem of Ultramar, a paradise of glass gardens and singing forests reached his ears. Yet pride, that ancient poison, lingered. The Ultramarines had broken Wyags and shattered chaos incursions. What threat could this ravenous namelessness pose? Prandium answered. The distress calls began as crisp, clipped battlefield updates from Captain Erican of the 3rd Company. Within hours, his voice frayed into raw static, screaming of skies black with wings and armored limbs snapping under carpets of chitin. The picked feeds showed no ruin. No craters, no shattered spires, just an empty ball of rock, scraped clean as a skull, its final moments captured in the cries of bolters firing until their barrels melted. 10 billion souls. 10 billion voices stilled between one breath and the next. In the privacy of his sanctum, Calgar knelt not in prayer, but in agony. The Codex Astartes, Gilliman's sacred gift, offered no solace. Its pages held no wisdom for an enemy without fear, without supply lines, without greed or ambitionally hunger eternal. He emerged transformed, his gaze burning with the cold fire of sacrifice. The pride of Ultramar would kill them all. He called the retreat, not from cowardice, but from cold calculus. If they tried to defend every world, they would bleed themselves white for nothing. Like a gardener pruning blighted branches, he gave the order to abandon a dozen systems, their screams swallowed by the encroaching shadow. The noble-born of Ultramar howled betrayal. Governors spat oaths of vengeance as their fleets limped back to Macragge. Calgar absorbed their fury and did not flinch. His fortifications rose bastions built into polar ice caps, trenches mined with phosphex that would burn even in vacuum artillery arrays designed by tech marines driven to near madness by the scale of what came. Across the capital world, mortal men and women of the Ultramar Auxilia sharpened bayonets and kissed Aquila pendants, their faces lit by the unnatural auroras of the storm tearing through the warp. When the Splinter fleet broke into the Macragge system, the stars wept acid. Bioships larger than hive cities blotted out the sun, their forms thrashing and reconfiguring mid-battle as if disdaining the laws of physics. Imperial Navy vessels, firing lances in disciplined volleys, watched in disbelief as their kills split apart only to reform into swarms of needle-like horrors. Void shields buckled under waves of living ammunition spore mines that erupted into corrosive mists, boarding pods that sprouted claws before breaching hulls. The defense fleet fought like wolves, their hulls bleeding plasma from 1,000 wounds, but the spores slipped through billions of them, seeding the stratosphere until Macragge's skies turned green with their descent. The polar fortresses took the brunt, their ancient guns roaring with salvos that turned night into day. Mountains of alien flesh piled against their walls, burned and burned again, yet still the swarm came. Calgar led from the front, his gauntlets caked in ichor thicker than blood, every thunderous blow of the gauntlets of Ultramar crushing predators larger than dreadnoughts. Alongside him, mortals fought and died by the thousands, their lasguns stitching fiery arcs into the gloom until the barrels warped, only to be trampled under tide after tide of scything limbs. Tech Marines triggered tectonic charges, rupturing continents to swallow entire hives of tunneling beasts. Librarians unleashed psychic storms that cooked synapses across the battlefield, their minds fraying under the Hive Mind's suffocating pressure. The ground itself seemed to rot underfoot, churned into sucking quagmires by burrowing horrors as the planet screamed. And in the darkest hour, as the northern fortress groaned under the weight of a living tsunami, Calgar made his choice. A retreat not of worlds, but of souls. Fall back to the Epsilon Bastion, he ordered. And then, with tears in his eyes no space marine would ever acknowledge, he gave the command that would haunt him until his dying breath detonate the cyclonic torpedoes buried beneath Macragge's crust. The fireball swallowed a third of the planet's surface, annihilating Ultramarines and Auxilia and Tyranids alike in a blaze of cosmic justice. When the ash settled, the remaining hive ships reeled, their synaptic web shattered by the sudden silence of millions of perished bioforms. The void battle turned. The Ultramarines, straining every shred of warmth from plasma drives choked with debris, drove a spear into the heart of the Splinter fleet. Biotitans died screaming in the cold dark, torn apart by Nova cannons fed by crews with nothing left to lose. The cost was written in the silence that followed. Macragge still stood, but gutted, bleeding, its northern wastes glassed by its defenders' hands. 3 companies of Ultramarines had been wiped from existence. Millions of mortal dead choked the trenches, but the shadow had been blunted for now. Cryptman, surveying the carnage from a ruined observation deck, understood this was not victory. It was a warning. Hive Fleet Behemoth would come again, hungrier, wiser, evolved by the taste of Ultramarine blood. Calgar, his armor scorched and gouged to bear ceramite, knelt in the ruins and swore an oath not of vengeance, but of vigilance. The first tyrannic war had ended, but the long devourance had only just begun. And in the darkness at the edge of the galaxy, countless more tendrils stirred, drawn by the scent of a species worth feasting up on a species that now knew true fear. The heavens roared with divine fire as bolt rounds and last beams tore through chitinous hordes, the very air thickening with acrid smoke and the ozone tang of discharged plasma. On the ravaged plains of Macragge, space marines in cobalt ceramite stood shoulder to shoulder with mortal soldiers whose faces were pale masks of terror beneath grime-streaked helmets, their lasguns spitting defiance into the endless tide. In the fractured northern fortress's adamantine walls, scarred by bioacid and rent by monstrous claws, Captain Sol Invictus bellowed orders through vox-gargled static, his Terminator-clad brothers forming an unbreakable bulwark against the howling darkness. This sacred armor, older than the Imperium itself, bore fresh gouges from talons that had shredded starships, yet still it held. Brother Maxilius, Storm Bolter, barked without cease, shells shredding hormagaunts into fleshy mist even as scything limbs pierced his gorget, his dying breaths a hymnal of vengeance. Sergeant Voros fought on long after his power fist crumpled against a hive tyrant's carapace, plunging his combat knife into black eyes until the beast crushed him in its jaws with a wet crack that echoed across the voxnet. Apothecary Centurion moved through the carnage like a ghost, his narthecium whirring as he harvested genocide from fallen brothers even as the walls pulsed with crawling bioluminescence, the fortress itself turning alien beneath their boots. For 6 days and nights, the First Company endured no resupply, no reinforcement, only the dwindling thump of bolters and the ever-present stench of ichor and spilled viscera. When comms fell silent on the 7th dawn, the Ultramarines who fought their way back found a necropolis of heroes. Mountains of Xenos corpses rose 10 meters high, slippery with gore, the last defenders buried beneath the weight of their slaughter. Inside the shattered command center, Invictus lay amidst 3 eviscerated Hive tyrants, his mangled armor still clinging to a skeleton threaded with sinew. Remains of his storm shield held the flickering log entry that would echo through chapter annals. "We die as we lived, brothers. We hold the line." 200 veterans lost warriors who had bled across the stars since the age of apostasy their sacrifice, carving a scar on Macragge's soul that would weep for centuries. Yet their bones were the fulcrum upon which victory tipped. Amidst orbital firestorms, Inquisitor Kryptman had glimpsed the beast's weakness. When Synapse ships died, lesser bioforms stumbled like puppets with severed strings. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar, commanding from the burning bridge of the Octavius, pivoted the fleet's wrath onto those pulsating leviathans. For every Hive ship scoured from the void, 3 Imperial vessels died screaming the ardent blade, detonating in a corona of burning crewmen. The litany of steel torn apart by living ordnance at each kill sent ripples of disarray through the swarming fleet. Salvation came howling from the warp battle fleet Tempest, answering astropathic screams. The Dominus Astra, a cathedral of plasteel and fury, rammed into the heart of the swarm. As bioships enveloped its hull, Captain Orwin Devaney's triggered the warp engine's death knell. Reality screamed. The rift tore open like a festering wound, vomiting unholy light as it swallowed the Dominus Astra and 100 Tyranid monstrosities, leaving only silence and drifting spores in its wake. Macragge's soil ran thick with alien offal as the leaderless hordes descended into cannibalistic frenzy of victory, but one that left Ultramar's fields salted with corpses, its fortresses broken teeth against a bruised sky. Calgar strode through the ruins of his monasterium, his gaze heavy with foresight. This was not an ending. Behemoth was but a tendril of something vast, ravenous, and patient. And while the spirit had blunted, another venom had already seeped into the Imperium's veins. Albogaris would never forget how his brother Thuro paused mid-sentence in their hab unit, blinking as if shaken from a dream. The Prometheum refinery's sulfurous stench suddenly forgot. That flicker behind his ice, wrongness, as if Albo were staring into a mirror whose glass had subtly cracked. Their bond had been forged in Lomas under Hive depths. 2 miners, sons sharing stolen nutrient paste and dreams of clean air, fingers calloused from wrenching precious ore from rock, until Thuro's maintenance crew delved into Sector Delta Gamma's sealed tunnels. What they awakened there did not kill them. Not immediately. The changes were small at first, Thuro's laughter turning hollow, his nightmares filled with whispered promises. He began attending union meetings in the dead shift, returning with pupils slit like a serpent's and a hunger that made Albo's skin crawl. On Icar IV, such whispers festered in the dark. The Brotherhood spread like mycelium through Lomas, suffocating lower decks, offering warm broth and colder hopes to the forgot. Their chapels rose where imperial tithes had bled worlds dry, spires clawing at smog-choked skies. Millions flocked to sermons promising a golden dawn of physical emperor, returning to uplift the toiling masses. Arbitrator Kelly's later found cult glyphs beneath the Brotherhood's altars, psychically resonant patterns humming with malignant energy. When Marina Vogue confessed, her eyes clear for the first time in 15 years, she spoke of soup kitchens dispensing drugged rations and priests whose hands brushed worshippers' foreheads, leaving psychic fingerprints. "They made you feel chosen," she wept, her voice raw from truth. Like the suffering meant something, like salvation was just one prayer away. The promised salvation tore Lomas apart at the seams. It began with the militia-sworn keepers of the peace unveiling hidden heavy stubbers on the Grand Cathedral's steps. Crowds who'd chanted for bread turned on arbitrators with bare hands and rusty shivs, their eyes glassy with brood-mind fervor. By the time planetary defense forces realized their commanders wore Brotherhood icons beneath their uniforms, Lomas was already burning. Governor Hax's severed head adorned the cathedral gates by nightfall. replaced by the Magusa thing of violet flesh and too many jointed limbs unfolding from vestments like a blasphemous flower. Third narration, hybrid offspring tore open their false skins, revealing chitinous ridges and lashing tongues, yet still their human thralls fought for them. Mothers strangled children who bore the aquila. Husbands found wives whispering to the walls in Xeno's tongues. The uprising was a cancer, metastasizing to quirkers scuttling defense monitors, cultist tech priests severing voxnets, brood brothers in enforcer carapace, dragging dissenters into sewers that pulsed with incubation sacs. When Inquisitor Agmer cut his way into a Brotherhood stronghold, the air reeked of amniotic fluid and betrayal. Hybrids scrabbled at him from shadowed ducts, their human faces stretched over alien skulls. His bolt pistol sang hymns of purgation, but the true horror lay in the nursereros upon rows of human infants swaddled in cult robes, their tiny fingers ending in razor-sharp claws. His fury was cold as void steel as he broadcast the exterminatus request, though he knew it would come too late. The astropathic choir on the Lex Talionis had already begun chanting the dirge that would summon ultramarines from the stars, but above the blood-soaked spires of Lomas, the sky was darkening with approaching bioships. The Hive fleet's shadow fell across Ikar IV, and what remained of Thoroughgaris looked up with all four eyes and smiled. The galaxy held its breath as the indomitable ultramarines descended upon Ikar IV, their cobalt armor still bearing the faint psychic scars of Macraga's ancient horror. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar's stratagem flared with cold fury. This world would not fall to the same ravenous hunger that had gnawed at Ultramar's heart. Beneath the spires of Lomas, where once imperial citizens had knelt beneath Stainagelass emperors now cracked by heretical hands, the air itself curdled with the stench of betrayal. Boltrons sheared through mutated flesh as cultists' neighbors. Shopkeepers, children's tutors hurled themselves at the Astartes lines with bone-shuddering abandon, their eyes glassy with the Patriarch's will. Then came the thunderclap of displaced reality, Terminators materializing amidst the cathedral's desecrated nave, their assault cannons whining as they turned sacred geometry into a slaughterhouse of ruptured chitin and spattering ichor. There, beneath the cathedral's sundered dome where kaleidoscopic light once blessed imperial sermons, the ancient horror awaited a patriarch whose talons were still clotted with the governor's DNA, whose psychic presence had coiled through Ikar IV's bloodstream for 2 silent centuries. The Terminators fought through waves of hybrid aberrations, their armor cracking under psychic shrieks that liquefied mortal nervous systems, until at last their thunder hammers found purchase in carapace older than the Hive cities themselves. As the creature's deathwill echoed through the substrata, 10,000 cultists across the planet spasmed like marionettes with severed strings, Albedo Garis watching in mute horror as his wife's eyes cleared an instant before her body crumpled, the last of her stolen life expended in the Patriarch's final psychic gasp. Liberation came not with triumphant hymns, but with the mechanical rasp of inquisitorial purity seals, Agmer's autoquills etching accusations onto miles of parchment, as his interrogators peeled back eyelids, searching for the telltale vestigial claws. Every executioner's shot echoed through Lammer's bullet-pocked plazas, where orphans like Marina Vull scavenged protein, paced amidst the rubble. Her brother's half-eaten data slate still clutched in hands too small to comprehend planetary treason. Above them, beyond atmospheres heavy with funeral pyres, the void itself grew pregnant with approaching hunger Hive fleet Kraken's vanguard organisms already tasting their beacon's demise. Tendrils of bioships light-years long curling toward Ikar IV. 250 years of complacency, shattered in a single astropathic scream, as sectors Gamma 7 through Theta 12 plunged into silence. Entire populations consumed mid-prayer in Hive chapels where once complacency had reigned. Imperial tacticians, clutching Behemothera battle plans, watched in mounting horror, as Kraken's splinter fleets performed maneuvers no natural evolution could devise, feinting toward agri-worlds only to engulf nearby forge planets, where munitions factories detonated in chain reactions visible from neighboring moons. On Merle Prime's wind-scored plateaus, Techmarine Finas, Auspex glowed with the last defiant biosigns of the Lamenters. Stand a brotherhood bankrupted by nobility, their yellow armor now barely visible beneath mountains of twitching gaunts whose acid blood dissolved the very stones beneath them. Cold static filled the Vox as Phenas recited their requiem, knowing their genocide died with them, another glorious lineage extinguished. Yet in the radioactive debris fields, where the strike cruiser Heart of Cronus listed with half its hull sheared away, Chaplain Thaddeus, basso profundo, rose above screaming reactor cores, his Crozius Arcanum conducting a symphony of survival as ratings in shredded uniforms rerouted power conduits beside trembling refugees clutching salvaged pick captures of drowned worlds. His Vox hail to the scattered life ships, "By the Emperor's grace we endure, by his will we ferry the innocent." Ignited stubberfire from janitors and PDF troopers alike, their makeshift barricades of corpse-locked termagants holding just long enough for the Ultramarines' gunships to pierce the spore clouds. When the survivors finally decompressed in Macrag's sterile docks, Thaddeus, armor still bore the handprints of children he'd carried through bioacid mists. Ikar IV's orbital plates burned with the phosphorescent green of Tyranid spore barrages as Agmar's chrono marked the planet's final hours, his ink-stained fingers trembling not from fear, but rage at lost potential. Below, Hive Lammer's Onsagran thoroughfares became vertical killing grounds, where Ultramarines fought back-to-back with Mechanicus war constructs, their shells detonating amidst hormigaunt swarms that turned staircase niches into thrashing machines of rending claws. Underground, in sumplit refugee tunnels, Medici orderlies administered Corpsistarch rations with trembling hands, while beyond the void shields entire habdistricts dissolved into seething digestion pools, their billion-strong populations screaming through the Hive Mind's psychic feedback until a merciful basilisk barrage silenced them. Yet amidst the biotitan footfalls that cracked continental plates, Magos Biologus Serpicans trembling servorm tweezered apart a Ravena's stilt-witching cerebral node, his bionic eye catching the fatal flaw genetic instability propagated through accelerated evolution, Kraken's own hunger outstripping its cohesion. When his data wine pierced the stratagem's clamor, Calgar's gauntleted fist froze mid-deployment, the grim epiphany spreading through command Vox like Prometheum ignition. Suddenly, the battlefield inverted, Predator squadrons abandoning perimeter holds to spearhead into chitinous behemoths, their turbolasers overcharged to gut Turvigans swollen with embryonic acid. Each fallen Carnifex cost the Hive Mind megatons of reabsorbed biomass, each synaptic creature's demise scattering swarms into disoriented prey. Salvation arrived not with fanfare, but exhaustion. Ultramarines dredged an ichor to the pauldrons, stumbling over landscapes where the very soil had become Tyranid carapace, finding only Radiation Zone 34's skeletal trees still standing witness to 9 billion absences. Agmar would later burn his mold-spotted uniform jacket, unable to purge the scent of digested hive blocks. While Ikar IV's survivors blinked in victory's unfamiliar light, the craftworld of Eandon sang its dirge under different stars, farseer councils fractured by visions of extinction, psychic static. Ranger Illith's report still hung in the Wraithbone auditoriums, ere her account of Kraken's shadow swallowing human colonies whole, each lost soul a potential neuron in the Hive Mind's implacable cortex. Now the weight of millennia pressed upon Eandon's spirit stones as the autarch nodded to the shrine attendants, their trembling hands cradling ancestors, soul gems to the nearest wraith construct sockets. Ancient spirits who had slumbered through centuries of craftworld politics now stirred within humming ghost helms, their first sensations the acrid tang of Tyranid spores against spectral senses. Along the craftworld's organic battlements, Wraithguard phalanxes raised weapon arms in perfect unison, the dead already outnumbering the living as Eandon's warship's psychoplastic beauty merged with ruthless function pirouetted through bioship tendrils, bright lances severing synaptic ganglia in bursts of actinic fire. Below, in the Infinity Circuit's shimmering core, the last living seer whispered forbidden pleas to long-slumbered gods, their spirit stone flaring with sacrificial power as the first boarding spores impacted the Wraithbone hull. Across war-torn sectors, Imperial victors and Eldari survivors alike understood these were but opening skirmishes against an enemy that needed neither supplies nor morale. Navigators aboard returning troop ships twitched in their amniotic tanks, dreaming of a distant galactic rim where Kraken's true body mass still drifted, numberless and eternal. Each tendril's defeat merely shed skin to the Hydra. In the silent depths of space, where Icar IV's orbital defenses, spun in frozen ruin, bodiless Tyranid spores, awaited the next quiet world, the next vulnerable mind, the next whispered promise of reunion with the Great Devourer. The void around unending shimmered with ghostly trails as Eldari vessels darted and wove through the advancing Tyranid swarm, wraithbone hulls gleaming like shards of frozen moonlight against the inky blackness. For a time, their strategy held striking with clinical precision at the bloated bioships from beyond the Hive fleet's reach, dancing just outside the lethal radius of acid sprays and bioplasma barrages. Within the craftworld's crystalline command domes, seers exhaled trembling breaths as momentary hope flickered, reflected in the luminescent battle maps tracing their defensive patterns. Yet the Great Devourer, ancient and insatiable, required no counsels to evolve. It changed. The first warnings came not from sensors, but from the choked screams of pilots as spore mines detonated silhouetted against their cockpits, birthing clouds of corrosive mist that dissolved wraithbone like sugar in water. Then came the new horror-select, chitinous forms uncoiling from gestation sacs aboard the Hive ships, their barbed limbs humming with predatory speed as they matched the Eldari vessels thrust for thrust, rending at hulls with talons dripping nervopoison. And always, the relentless advance of the shadow in the warp pressing down like a psychic smothering, fraying the threads of prophecy until all foresight burned to static. When the first boarding pods punched through Unending's outer skin, erupting into the cathedral-like forests where Eldari children had once traced constellations in bioluminescent pollen, they did not scream. Their elders had taught them silence a warrior's dignity in the face of eternity. Yet the silence broke when the first gaunt breached the inner sanctums, its shriek echoing through crystalline vaults where poetry had been whispered for millennia. Close-quarters fighting devolved into nightmarish intimacy in the craftworld's arteries, Rangers firing shuriken pistols point-blank into snapping claws before being dragged down, bones cracking like seasoned wraithwood underfoot. The ghost warriors emerged then from their silent crypts, wraithbone shells animated by soulfire implacable, fearless, their every strike a ballet of 10,000-year memories unleashed. Where living Eldari stumbled over the corpses of kin, these revenants marched unflinching into tides of chitin and fang, their constructs blazing like fallen stars as they bought corridors, galleries, heartbeats. For a time, they held, until the shrine of a sermon fell, until the forests, nurtured by song and dream, began to scream as the Tyranid digestive pools spread their corrupting roots. Salvation came cloaked in infamy. Prince Ioril's Corsair fleet tore into real space not with humility, but with the howling vengeance of exile denied closure. His flagship, a dagger of scarred wraithbone and stolen Imperium plating, fired first upon the Tyranid swarm before hailing Unending's crumbling defenses in a voice both sneering and raw with unhealed wounds. He had sworn oaths beneath these same stars never to return, to let the craftworld's ossified traditions choke on their own sanctimony. Yet as Klaxons wailed and biomechanical horrors breached the final seals of the world's shrine, loyal Tibeter, unwanted had compelled him. His corsairs fought like specters freed from chains, their ships pirouetting through the void in patterns half-remembered from his youth commanding Unending's fleets. On the ground, Iorile himself led the countercharge through the defiled gardens of Saemlan, his blade a silver blur in the spore-choked air, his laughter bitter medicine to defenders who'd forgotten victory's taste. And then came the Avatar Kala Mencha Khan's incarnation, summoned not by ritual, but by the craftworld's collective agony, rising from the ashes of consumed shrines. Its sword-carved swathes of molten death through the swarm, each swing trailing screams incinerated mid-roar, its very presence reigniting wraithbone constructs into furious, fleeting life. The aftermath stank of pyres. 4/5 gone. Artisans whose hands had shaped psychic symphonies into matter, reduced to unrecognizable char. Spirit stone-scurrying within them, the whispered wisdom of cycles uncounted shattered under alien claws, their songs severed in the warp like snapped harp strings. The silence left behind in Unending's hollowed halls grew teeth, gnawing at the survivors who walked past empty domiciles where each untouched loom, each cold teacup, accused them with absence. The ghost warriors who remained intact grated their palms against their own wraithbone forms, corpses twice over once in flesh, now in purpose. Some returned unwillingly to their stasis lumber. Others stalked the ravaged perimeter like malfunctioning automatons, too wounded in spirit to release the rage burning through their soul matrices. Iriel departed at dawn without a word to the surviving autarchs, his silhouette black against the burning wreckage of 1,000 bioships. They offered no thanks. He left no promises. Only a single teardrop of molten wraithglass pressed into the command console, where he'd once plotted patrol route as a relic of anger frozen solid. Hive Fleet Kraken's dissolution bred horrors in fractal proliferation. Without the crushing weight of its synapse core, the remnants scattered like spores on a stellar wind 100 smaller fleets, mutating independently in the cold between stars. Admiral Quintus of Battlefleet Solaris watched in nausea as auger feeds showed Tyranids on frontier world Drexler, V bursting from underground rivers not as gaunts, but as bloated amphibious horrors with gill slits pulsing in toxic atmospheres. In the Damocles Gulf, Tiao fire warriors perished mid-broadcast transmission, their pulse rifles useless against bioforms armored in hyperdense bone plates grown after Imperial engagements. The Hive Mind learned, and each splinter reported back not through Vox or Astropath, but through some unfathomable communion etched in devoured DNA. By 993 M41, the war was declared over Gaunt's Lie. The veterans called it in smoke-filled barracks. For every annihilated Kraken tendril birthed 10 newborns with stranger, crueler appetites. Inquisitor Cryptman, gaunt 40 years from a lifetime spent staring into the Devourer's maw, warned the Senatorum Imperialis of patterns coalescing in the deep void, imminent and hungry. They dismissed him, until the astropaths began screaming downward. His sanctum aboard the Emperor's vigilance reeked of Styx host and unwashed robes. Acolyte Thurn, trembling as he administered another cortical booster, noted how Cryptman's fingers left smears of corroded green where they gripped the strategic hololith, the mappins quivering with palsied intention. Leviathan's name came from the dying gasp of a rogue trader relay, before static swallowed the signal whole. Unlike Behemoth's reckless spurthrust or Kraken's devouring swarm, this fleet moved with predatory intellect, ascending from the galactic south like claws from beneath a crib. It avoided Macrag's bulwarks, skirted Vorash's cannon bastions, bypassing every killing field planned with such meticulous care after the last war. Instead, Leviathan's twin proboscis zone curving through Armageddon's periphery, the other punching coreward near Necromunda's, Hivespearl threatened to snip the Imperium's torso from its limbs. Cryptman's hands shook not from fatigue, but fury. The hololith showed what High Command ignored. At Baal, reports described bioconstructs shrugging off bolty rounds with carapace grown harder than ceramite overnight, absorbing lessons from Kraken's defeat. The Scorched Earth directive crystallized not in some vaulted debate chamber, but amidst the visceral squalor of Cryptman's unwashed quarters, the screams of his overstrained astropaths still echoing in his skull like tinnitus. Deny the beast its feast. Burn the crops, salt the fields, starve the god. On Phosphor III, Colonel Vojan's plea "let us fight, damn you, let us die with last guns hot," was erased by orbital bombardment so thorough. 7 hours later, not even bacteria writhed in the irradiated soil. Cryptman's scribes marked the death warrant in crisp high Gothic. He marked it too later, in the ledger behind his eyes, where a dwindling column labeled soul hemorrhaged numerals like clotted blood. 4 to 7 worlds. 4 to 7 candles snuffed by his hand, not the Tyranids. Hive cities evacuated, then virus-bombed into collapsing chasms of boiling flesh. Agrospheres torched into blackened marbles where once wheat waves had danced beneath false suns. Refugees choked transit lanes, plague ships adrift between stars, their holds echoing with the wet coughs of the doomed. When Leviathan scouts finally reached these systems, they found only ashes and the mocking radiation signature of Imperial hate. Slowed, yes. Starved, perhaps. But in the sagging faces of orphans crammed into Cardinal Station's overflow decks, Cryptman saw no Victorianly inheritance. The whispers in the Inquisition's shadowed halls sharpened not the monster, now, but their monster, his compassion calcified into a weapon too dreadful to behold. Each night as sedatives dragged him unwilling toward nightmares, he saw Vojan's face not on Phosphor III, but hovering in the sterile air of his quarters, demanding answers he could no longer articulate. Leviathan crawled onward, slower but undiverted, its hive ships pulsing with embryonic adaptations birthed from desperation rather than hunger. Cryptman knew, better than any living being, that the Hive Mind learned voraciously where the Imperium merely reacted. His Scorched Earth gambit would buy a decade, perhaps a century no more. Even now, other absorptive probabilities unfolded in the dark between galaxies, tendrils reaching toward Baal, toward Holy Terra itself. The condemned refugees' curses followed him in waking and sleep alike. Let him watch his precious Imperium burn, they spat, unknowing prophets of mankind's midnight. Cryptman nodded, alone, as he marked the hololith with fresh red pins. He would watch. He would remember. And when Leviathan's maw yawned wide beneath Terra's golden light, he would burn 1,000 more worlds with dry eyes and steady hand. That was the cost of seeing clearly when all others flinched await his intimate, unending communion with damnation. The galaxy trembled under the weight of Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman's last, desperate stratagem. His name now whispered with equal parts reverence and revulsion across guttering lumen lines of Imperial outposts. Cast out by the very institutions he had bled to protect, stripped of honor and title by peers who could noter would not stomach the necrotic calculus of survival, the once illustrious servant of the Golden Throne found sanctuary only in shadows. Loyal Deathwatch brothers, their blackened armor still bearing acid scars from Tyranid wars fought at Cryptman's side, shielded their fallen mentor as he spun his final web. Shrouded in data vaults hidden deep within drifting ghost ships and derelict asteroid fortresses, his gnarled hands shaking now, not from fear, but from 5 decades of combat stims gnawing at his nervous, system-keyed encrypted missives to Chapter Master Asath. Octarius, he wrote, the word vibrating with terrible promise. The Crucible. Let them feast upon each other's flesh, these twin devourers. The plan unfolded with clinical precision. A space hulk vomited forth from the warp's foul belly, ripe with genestealer broods harvested by kill teams under Cryptman's phantom command, the Xenos parasites carefully deposited on the feral world of Gist like rotting bait cast into stagnant waters. And the beast took it. The Hive Mind's psychic shriek of triumph reverberated across the Empyrean as Leviathan's endless swarm diverted toward the Octarius sector, drawn by the gravitational pulse of 1 trillion orc heartbeats thundering in bestial unison. Warlord Gazu's iron-fisted Empyra stinking, roaring sprawl of fungal towers and scrap megacities stretching across 19-star system shed no inkling of the shadow passing over them until the first bioships blotched their green-skinned moons with leprous shadows. What followed was no war, but something older, purer, more obscene collision of 2 apex predators locked in the galaxy's most primal embrace. Billions died by the hour, the orcs bellowing their savage joy even as chitinous scythelims sheared through mobs of howling greenskins, their severed heads still grinning as acid bile dissolved cartilage and bone. Spore launchers carpeted Tyranid advance corridors with fungal explosives, their detonations birthing new generations of orcs mid-charge, squirming from the mud to join the fray with primal roars. And through it all, in hidden oculus chambers far from the front lines, Cryptman watched with bloodshot eyes as Leviathans swarm no longer merely consuming begin to evolve. Fresh bioforms shambled from digestion pools, their carapaces unnervingly hybridized brutish orc musculature, straining beneath glistening Tyranid chitin, rending claws now studded with jagged, rusted scrap metal torn from fallen warbuses. Ghoulish reports reached him of carnifexes vomiting clouds of orchid spores, of lictors whose pheromone trails stank of fungal rot. The bitter irony choked him like cordite smoke. In his sanctum, surrounded by flickering hololith maps charting the cancer spread, Cryptman clutched the silver rosette he could no longer legally bear, a relic of better days, and rasped a curse that echoed the damned. All sacrifices, his and countless others, to gift the Great Devourer new teeth. Somewhere in the sector's eastern reaches, Deathwatch kill teams skulked through spore-choked ruins, recording Nightmaressa Swarmlord whose spiked tail now dripped with viscous, greenskin-hued venom, termagant sprouting crude iron gob contraptions from distended flesh. The orcs, in turn, became stranger, fouler. Mechboys grafted stolen bioacid glands onto shock rifles, weirdboys convulsed with stolen Hive Mind visions, their skulls distending into bulbous, synapseno tumors. This was no longer where it was a grotesque symposium of mutual annihilation, a Darwinian hellscape where only the most profane innovations survived. And when the cytoplasmic dust settled, the Imperium would face an evolved abomination. Cryptman knew this truth in his marrow, even as his last loyal allies begged him to flee impending retribution. His final transmission before vanishing into the dark, embedded with scrambler codes only the Deathwatch High Council could parse, contained just 9 bleak words. "We have lit a fire we cannot possibly extinguish." 600 light-years coreward, where the galactic east bled into the crimson sands of Baal, another relic of better days stared into the coming storm. Commander Dante stood barefaced beneath a bruised twilight sky, his golden death mask discarded beside him like a discarded skin. The night winds, scouring across 1,500 years of weretrinkles, carried the ozone tang of void shields straining under orbital bombardment. Below the Arx Angelicum's ramparts, the Radissert pulsed with mobilization-tribal conscripts hauled hulking last cannon emplacements across dunes, their chants of sanguinius, raw against the growing staticus of Tyranid atmospheric entry. Dante's bones ached with prescience. He knew this danced, deceptive lull before biostorms broke, the ghastly calculus of delaying actions. His orders to the fleet had been unequivocal: trade ships for hours, lives for meters. Crimson-clad fleet masters saluted him via grainy vox links as their battle barges ignited engines for suicide runs at Hive ship tendrils, buying time for the last Thunderhawks to evacuate children from the sulfur mines of Baal Secundus. Young Akio felt the deck plates tremble seconds before sirens split the air. They'd been herded underground, the Angel's servants barking orders when the ceiling collapsed in a shower of rockcrete and wriggling death. Something skittered on too many legs, its talons sparking against stone. He ran blindly, bare feet slapping frigid tiles, chasing flickering emergency lumens that died one by one behind him. The shelter's innards choked with smoke, and the butcher shop reek of opened intestines. He stumbled into daylight to find his world transformed sky itself hemorrhaging spores like malignant pollen, each impact crater birthing skittering horrors that peeled armored space marines apart with disturbing precision. A lictor's barbed tongue lashed past his ear, and in that suspended moment, Akio realized with childish clarity that the angels could bleed crimson ceramite cracked. Blood dappled the sand the same shade as his father's when the Radpox took him. Brother Rafin's arrival wasn't accompanied by fanfare or battle cry, just the wet thump of a chainsword bisecting chitin, the whine of actuators as a gauntlet yanked Akio airborne. The boy stared dumbly at the warrior clutching hymned battle-scorched pauldron, the blood drop icons smeared with ichor, and understood why even monsters feared angels. This close, Rafin's vox grunt sounded like grinding boulders. "Hold the pistol tight, little brother." The weapon's weight nearly dislocated Akio's wrist, its grip still warm from the dead serf who'd wielded it moments prior. High above, Dante absorbed real-time holographs of the Void War's death throes. Imperial fist battlecruisers, their hulls bleeding air from 1,000 breaches, spun lazily into bioplasma torrents, their demise blotting out entire Auspex sectors with static. A Death Company strike cruiser rammed itself down a Hive ship's pulsating maw, its warp drives overloading the explosion momentarily brighter than Baal's pallid star. Good deaths. Necessary losses. Below, the surface reports grew dire genestealer cults boiling from forgotten underworld hives, digester pools leaching into aquifers to birth screamer killers beneath the Arx itself. The fortress monastery's lower levels ran slick with mixed blood Astartes and Tyranid ichor swirling in grotesque symbiosis. In makeshift triage bunkers, apothecaries cursed as newly encountered bioforms tore through coatings of ceramite even Terminator plate couldn't withstand. Their claws somehow permeated with an acidic compound stolen from mech-crafted weaponry. The Hive Mind had learned, adapted hybridized horrors born from Octarian lessons, now loosed upon Baal's defenders. Dante gripped the balisword at his hip, its ancient blade forged by Vulcan himself. All strata of resistance were buckling stalker-pattern bolters, overheating from endless waves of gaunts. Tech Marines rerouting fortress power amidst fungal infestations clogging plasma conduit send, yet hope flickered in odd quarters. Tribesmen clawed Tyranid warriors down with mining tools, buried genestealers under rock slides triggered by crude explosives, bought chapter serfs precious seconds to reload macrocannons. Akio, trembling behind a barricade of dead termagants, fired his pistol into a ripper's tide until its power cell died. When Rafin fell not to claws or teeth, but to a stranglevine spore that burst from his gorget cell, the boy did not weep. He picked up the Astartes combat knife, its grip swallowing both small hands, and waited. Neither knew of the Shadow War raging parallel to Thersoft Deathwatch saboteurs, breaching Tyranid splinter fleets to inject tailored neurotoxins, of Kryptman's rumored last gambit from his Octarius observation post. But the cosmic balance had tipped. Somewhere in the benighted reaches beyond astronomic and light, prognosticators whispered of a third force stirring the Great Devourer and greenskin hordes locked in evolutionary oblivion, birthing hybrid horrors that defied imperial taxonomy. For now, though, Baal burned. Dante donned his mask as bioships blotted out stars above the Ark's Angelicum. Akio held the knife tighter, deaf to all but his own heartbeat and the rasp of his breath against recycled air. Kryptman, whomever and wherever he was, had gambled eternity on a theory. Now reality answered in claw marks across fortress walls, in the wet crunch of Baal's defenders being pressed ever backward. There would be no bombardments to sterilize this world, no inquisitorial sanction to make martyrs of survivors, just the bone-deep understanding that should Baal hold, it would owe no thanks to absent gods or disgraced saviors. Only blades, only blood. The Tyranids came, and the Imperium met them, some with bolters roaring, some with knives trembling in small hands. The line between salvation and damnation had never seemed thinner, nor more irrelevant. Both sides had their monsters now. Let them meet in the red dust and decide the shape of nightmares yet to come. The defenders met the alien tide with bolt and blade, a storm of ceramite and righteous fury that shattered the first waves in showers of chitinous viscera. In those early days, when the air still smelled of promethium rather than spilled ichor, the sons of Sanguinius wove a symphony of death across Baal's rad-scorched plains. Veteran sergeants barked orders honed through centuries of warfare, their targeting lashes flicking unerringly to synapse creatures that crumpled like marionettes with severed strings. The flesh terrors carved highways through the living sea, chain axes howling hymns of dismemberment where the swarm pressed thickest. Lamenters stood shield to shield in the storm, their defiant chants rising above biohorror shrieks as they held ground long after auspexes had declared their positions untenable. Blood drinkers melted through poisoned mists and ash dunes, emerging in geysers of gore where the Hive Mind least expected them. For 7 days and nights, the chapters bled the swarm white, but every slain warrior left a gap no living brother could fill, every spent magazine a silent dirge beneath the roar of guns. The victories gleamed like poisoned gems, beautiful and deadly, for the Xenos tide did not crash it seeped, it eroded, it gnawed at the edges with relentless, mindless hunger. By the third week, the outer bastions ran red with wasted valor. Men who'd held the Cadian Gate found themselves retreating from trenchworks drowned beneath living mulch. Val Secundus vanished in a tsunami of rippers, its last transmission choked with the carmine blades, battle cries as Generatora overloaded in their final embrace. On Baal Prime, Gabriel Seth's Voxcast snarls cut through the static. Still standing, you toothless abomination. Come taste the wrath of cursed angels. Yet even his defiance couldn't mask the truth etched in the Arcangelicum's smoldering stratagem hololiths. Chief Librarian Mephiston, veins black with psychic strain, rasped warnings of shifting biosignatures as fresh horrors peeled from gestation sacs creatures armored against yesterday's weaknesses, loped through yesterday's kill zones. Then came the tremor through the warp, sharp as a scalpel slicing sanity, and every psyker in the fortress monastery screamed as one. The Swarm Lord had come, a venging Semade monster whose 4 bone swords remembered every death dealt to its prior incarnations. Command posts became charnel houses overnight. Trigons erupted through sanctified marble floors beneath the sanguinary priesthoods apothecarian, slaughtering the wounded midsurgery. Bioplasma rained on ammunition depots, chosen not by chance, but cold calculus. 5 chapter masters fell in as many hours Trisolian of the golden blood impaled Midrian cry, Vorian of the martyrs, vow drowning in his own liquefied armor after a spore mine's kiss. Brother Rafin stopped counting familiar faces in the meat-grinder defense of Depot Kappa, focusing instead on the youth fighting at his flank. Akio's hands no longer trembled when reloading, though his eyes shone with the glassy sheen of mortally wounded prey. Synapse beast, left flank. Rafin's roar came raw as a gut wound. His chainsword shrieked through a knot of razor-limbed hormagaunts just as the wall exploded in a hail of fleshy shrapnel, revealing the hulking terror of a cycliclod carnifex. Rafin tasted copper as he hurled Akio behind him, power armor servos screaming under the killing blow's descent, until radiance hotter than a dying star flooded the chamber. The Sanguiner's blade carved glyphs of annulment in the beast's flank, golden steel moving faster than mortal eyes could follow. When the apparition vanished as suddenly as it came, Rafin found the boy staring slack-jawed at mountains of twitching carapace. "Sanguinius watches," Rafin gasped, though the cold calculus of war told him even angels couldn't hold back this tide forever. By the 4th week, the Archangelicum itself became the crucible, its adamantium bones groaning under acid tides. Dante stood unmoving in the storm's eye as his command center dissolved around him. The golden death mask hid his hollowed cheeks, but not the leaden weight in his voice when addressing the 17 bloodied survivors who'd once been the Blood Angels' 3rd Company. "Make them purchase each step with oceans," he commanded, words slurring around the failure of his rejuvenat implants. Then came the tremor unlike any other, not the muffled thump of artillery, but a Nelson screaming soul vibration that sent Mephiston crashing to his knees, blood geysering from his nostrils. High above Baal, reality tore like hemorrhage. The great rift yawned wide, vomiting raw chaos into the void. Bioships burst like rotting fruit in its apocalyptic maw, thousands snuffed instantly. But where salvation gleamed, damnation followed on Baal Prime's corpse-littered plains. Cab and his talons shredded spacetime itself. The Bloodthirster's arrival choked the air with the brass and blood stench of Khorne's realm, its vortex of wings blotting out what remained of the sky. Rubbery Tyranid flesh crisped in the demon's hellfire aura, but Cab and his burning gaze never strayed toward Seth's battered warriors. "Mine," it growled with tectonic fury, cleaving a biomechanical hierogule apart in one shrieking axe blow. "These pretty birds belong to the Skull Throne." Seth spat a curse, and a ruptured lung's worth of blood when the renegade Knights of Blood charged past him without orders, war cries devolving into the Black Rage's guttural howls. Their doomed assault bought Seth precious minutes small coin for the new nightmare, revealed when Baal's own skies ignited with unnatural auroras. Gilliman's armada pierced the storm like spears of redemption. Thunderhawks fell like silver comets alongside strange new drop pods that impacted with seismic fury. Chapter Master Carlion stared slack-jawed as a 3-meter colossus clad in MKX Gravis plate disembarked from a storm raven, its bolt rifle roaring sustained fire that liquefied 3 Tyranid warriors in as many heartbeats. "Primaris!" Carlion barely registered the newcomer's designation Voxcast, too focused on parrying a lictor's killing strike until a massive fist closed around the Xenos' skull and crushed it like overripe fruit. Lieutenant Tobias's helmet tilted in greeting voice modulator, somehow conveying wry amusement. "Save the awe for after the battle, brother. This swarm won't purge itself." Their countercharge became an avalanche of wrath. In the Archangelicum's breached sanctuary, Rafin and Akio choked on caustic smoke as towering inceptors descended on pillars of fire, their assault bolters hosing streams of shells so potent a bio-titan stumbled under their weight. Yet through the sudden roaring hope came a concussion that buckled meter-thick blast doors the swarm lord itself, psychic hatred radiating in waves as it sought vengeance against the architect of its frustrations. Dante met the abomination blade to blade in a hurricane of sparks, the axe mortalis screaming against chitinous sword arms thicker than his torso. Pain flared through ancient joints with every parry as the monster's prior incarnations learned, adapted, predicted each clash a century's worth of warfare compressed into microseconds. Mephiston's cryogenic corpse lay nearby, the librarian's final act freezing the swarm lord's ankles to the deck, buying Dante the split second needed to strike true. The axe's disruptor field flared nova-bright as it plunged into the Synapse-beast's thorax. Ichor boiled like molten lead across Dante's cuirass as the mortally wounded Xenos spasmed, one final wild slash hammering him into stonework hard enough to crack his armored ribs. Darkness beckoned, sweet and cool, but golden wings eclipsed the shadows, their feather tips brushing his soul with fatherly benediction. Consciousness returned to the sterile tang of Metabay antiseptics, and a presence heavier than the throne world. Gilliman's stormgrey eyes held millennia of sorrow as he spoke the edict that would become both salvation and Shackle's Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilus, Warden of the Shattered Void. Behind him, Mephiston's reborn form studied Dante with alien intensity, while Seth's familiar snarl echoed from the courtyard, where flesh terrors brawled with their Primaris kin. Somewhere in the bonefields beyond, Cabenta's laughter still rumbled through reality's wounds, but Dante heard only the rattle of his own faltering hearts as Gilliman's words carved fresh burdens into his soul. The golden mask lay discarded now, revealing a face that even rejuvenats couldn't preserve from the inexorable erosion of endless war. Duty remained. The throne of Nihilus awaited. Sanguinius' sun straightened his shattered spine and rose. The dual moons hung heavy in Baal's ash-choked sky, their pallid light illuminating landscapes scoured clean of life, where once hive cities had pulsed with humanity's defiant clamor. Baal Prime stood as a monument to desecration, silent plains, stretching beneath skeletal orbital spires. Mountains of Xenos skulls, meticulously arranged into the profane sigil of corn looming like blasphemous cathedrals. Cabal's mocking testament carved in bone and calcified hatred. 5 companies of the Blood Angels had been reduced to shattered remnants, scars not merely upon their crimson armor, but etched into their genetic legacy. Ancient war machines lay broken in the toxic mud, dreadnought sarcophagi cracked open like desecrated eggs, their noble occupants silenced forever. Veterans who'd weathered the eye of terror for 5 centuries fell to chitinous claws, lifetimes of sacred knowledge extinguished in the swarm's wake. Yet from this devastation came strange rebirth, not Gilbert's reinforcements alone, but the organic thrum of Baal's own resurrection. Under Arcano's direct oversight, the apothecarian glowed with fresh Promethean fires as neophytes underwent the agonizing metamorphosis into Primaris brothers. Young Akios' screams echoed through sterile chambers as his bones elongated and new organs took root, Rafin's gauntleted hand gripping the aspirant's shoulder, a mirror image of his own induction millennia, past when Baal's deserts had scoured his tribal soul raw for this crimson brotherhood. Dante knelt before the golden sarcophagus, the slight tremor in his ancient hands masked only by the flicker of devotional candles. Sanguinius' death mask reflected back not serenity, but the ghostly afterimages plaguing his vision, futures written in blood and warpfire, where Leviathan's tendrils curled around Ultramar's throat, and Hive Fleet Chronos devoured lighthouse worlds in the pathless dark. We endured. Mephiston's voice resonated like a blade drawn from millennia-old scabbard, his psychic aura casting crimson shadows across the relic's burnished surface. Dante's reply emerged hoarse, weighed by the ghosts of 10,000 battles. Endurance is not victory, old friend. Only the prelude to greater trials. Beyond Baal's scarred orbit, the war continued its ravenous march. Relict splinter fleets, severed from Leviathan's core consciousness by the Great Rift's birth pangs, stalked the Segmentum Pacificus, tendrils brushing agri-world outposts unlucky enough to pierce the galactic gloom. Octarius birthed new nightmares as orc spores mutated under the Hive Mind's predation, creating unfathomable bioforms that howled challenges to distant Hive ships. And in the infinite chill between galaxies, the Devourer contemplated its temporary failures, synapse networks alight with echoes of Imperial weaponry patterns, void ship weak points, biological data extracted from Blood Angel corpses dissected in nightmarish digestion pits. Armaglass windows shuddered under the artillery report of Tarsus Secundus, mountain storms, rain etching liquid trails across reinforced panes where Mero's Herodian's reflection overlapped the wilderness beyond. Ink-stained fingers traced the embossed title on his manuscripts, cover the nature and movements of the Great Devourer, Vol. XVII, feeling the weight of worlds rather than mere vellum beneath his touch. Behind him, the chamber hummed with the accumulated detritus of decades-long vigil missae's quiet breath, fogged delicate glass display cases housing Tyranid tissue samples. Octavius, snore-syncing with the rhythmic glow of his bionic eye, Helis's neural jack threads pulsing as she imprinted Herodian's latest tactical projections onto astropathic dead matter scrolls. The amber hololith dominated the eastern wall, its constellations of threat markers winking balefully here in Agri-World's placid blue shifting to sickly ochre as Genestealer cult hymns corrupted vox channels. They're a cluster of warning runes coalescing into probable swarm vector trajectories. Herodian's augmented lens clicked softly as it refocused, zooming past his own weary reflection in the rain-lashed glass, past the glow of Auspex scanners atop distant gun towers, past the kilometer-wide kill zones where flamethrower emplacements kept the wilderness at bay, to fix upon nomadic campfires glittering like trapped stars in the foothills. their crude songs praising star angels drifted up through atmospheric scrub even now, filtering through the storm's basso profundo. He envied sometimes the simplicity of their devotion, untroubled by the knowledge that for every hive tendril documented in his treatise, 100 more slithered unseen through the void's lightless gulfs. The quill lay discarded, its nib split from recording Captain Messinus. Final transmission before Hive ship Jormungandr swallowed his strike cruiser whole static scorched words about chitinous boarding pods ripping through reality itself via synaptic displacement. Herodian lifted the stasis casket lid, the act feeling like sealing a tomb. Inside nestled not only his manuscript but secondary data slates crammed with biochemical autopsies, stratagem meeting transcripts revealing bitter space marine rivalries hampering defenses, even pick captures of refugee children's scribbles depicting nightmares their young minds couldn't comprehend. Lightning flared, bleaching the chamber white for one crystalline moment, Herodian's ruined eye watering from augmented glare. Octavius jerking awake with a string of binary profanity. Helis's transmission sigils blooming urgent crimson before darkness crashed back. Deeper now, the stench of ozone and mountain loam seeping through ancient air recirculators. Somewhere below, failed void shields coughed discharge into the mud, warped impeners sang their protective hymnals, and the great guns began their slow, tectonic rotation skyward. Archivist? Herodian didn't turn from the window, his voice rasping like dry parchment. Helis paused mid-stroke, her augmetic fingers poised above the runeboard. How many copies will reach Macragge before? Optimistic projection places one in Gilliman's hands within 18 solar months, barring warp anomalies. Her reply carried the brittle precision of shattered porcelain reassembled by Servorm. The others, Terra, S. Administratum alone knows. A gnarled hand rose to touch his faded purity seal, the wax still holding faint warmth from long-dead lector Primus Gentauris benediction. To record is to worship, the oath scroll proclaimed, though tonight it felt like building sand barriers against tidal inevitability. Beyond the streaming glass, the tempest howled its nihilistic symphony, while Herodian's inner eye replayed survivor testimonies guard officers, trembling through descriptions of capillary towers birthing winged horrors, rogue traders whispering of outer dark shapes dwarfing Hive ships, a dying salamander's librarian's fading vision of golden-armored giants battling shadow beasts beneath a black sun. At dawn, the storm's fury would break. Come morning light, the stasis casket would begin its odyssey through webway shards and warp-tinted merchant lanes, its warnings pressed against the encroaching night like flesh against a knife's edge. But for these final hours, Herodian remained scholar sentinel at the edge of comprehension, watching raindrops chase each other down the armaglass like Tyranid spore trails through dead star systems, his reflection superimposed over the firefly glimmer of those distant tribal hearths. They didn't know, those mountain nomads singing to their crude effigies of Sanguinius, how precariously the fragile candle of their existence burned. They couldn't fathom that the hunger stalking the void learned faster than any imperial tactician, forgot nothing, and above all, endured. The Blood Angels reforged their shattered companies in Baal's radioactive crucible, young Akio's transformed body thrumming with fresh sinews, even as phantom pains from discarded mortal nerves made him scream in his sleep. Arkan Land's ancient templates gave birth to new war machines in Marsforge annexes, their reactor cores pulsing like embryonic hearts. Dante's visions crystallized into contingency plans, distributed fleet-wide evacuation protocols, scorched world decrees, last resort cyclonic torpedo trajectories. Herodian's final entry in volume XVII's appendix trembled with uncharacteristic subjectivity. The Devourer's greatest strength lies not in biological perfection, but in absence of doubt. It does not question. It does not hesitate. It propagates. We, meanwhile, drown in questions until the tide takes us. Lightning stabbed the mountains again. Closer this time, the gun towers, blessed ammunition glowing like saintly halos in their loading racks. Helis's machinery spitting out fresh warnings about biosignatures in upper atmospheres. Rafen drilling Akio on bolter drills 12 systems away as Tyranid spores hibernating in Baal's bedrock sensed Primaris heat signatures and began their slow, inevitable mitosis. Endurance indeed, against the dying of the light. Against the god machine of perfect hunger lurking beyond the galaxy's rim. Against the knowledge that survival is merely the prelude to greater trials. Herodian's fingers found the quill instinctively, already scratching at a half-formed thought about genestealer cult proliferation rates in asteroid mining communes. The galaxy bled, the Imperium limped on, and somewhere between the ink and the blade, between the scholar's vigil and the angel's sword, endurance became the only sacrament left. He wrote. The guns waited. Somewhere in the lightless deeps between galactic arms, endless jaws flexed